Welcome back. It's time to head out into Bangkok again, and this time instead of hitting the streets, we're going to go to one of their more popular parks, which is actually right in the heart of Bangkok, close to one of their SkyTrain stations. But in saying that, the video this week will be slightly different because, for reasons I can't figure out as yet, my GoPro decided not to work on the day I went out. I have no idea why. I'm going to try and get it fixed to do what I can so that I don't have to buy a new one as yet. So just something to bear in mind. Most of the video that you'll see today will be of each particular location that I head out to. There won't be any walking around because I couldn't attach this to my bag. But in saying that, fingers crossed I get it working before the next time we head out, because I do like bringing you guys along with me, and showing you how I get there adds a lot more than just seeing the final location, so to speak. But stay tuned for the end, because I'll show you how I take this photo and turn it into this photo in Lightroom without needing to worry about using something like HDR, where you get Lightroom to blend multiple exposures, or taking two separate exposures and blending them together yourself in Photoshop later on. This is one photo where we'll use their new masking techniques. I say new, but they're about 6 months old, to be able to take this raw photo and make it this final image instead. But enough prattling from me, let's go check out the park and wait till you see how the sky looks as sunset comes up as well, because I was actually facing east when we got those colors in the sky that you'll see towards the end. I hope you like those photos. If you would like to visit this park, it is only about a 5 to 10 minute walk away from the Asok BTS station. Don't make my mistake and going one station further on the subway, because there is no entrance to the park from that side. The only entrance is close to Asok, and it's about a 5 to 10 minute walk depending on how fast you walk naturally. As promised, let's see how I can take this raw photo and turn it into this finished photo in Lightroom. So let's jump on the computer and I'll show you how we can do it. As you can see, I've got a very dark foreground and an almost blown out sky with this image. I would like you to remember though that I can only actually do this edit because my sky isn't completely blown out. If it is a case where you have exposed for the foreground only and the sky is completely blown out, trying to get any of the detail and data back from the image is going to be very hard, because the way the camera would process it is that it's just pure white. There's no shadows, there's no highlights, there's no blacks. It's just pure white, and trying to recover any detail, while possible, would be very, very difficult instead. So bear that in mind. If you do have a blown out sky, like completely blown out and you can't see anything, you may not be able to use this technique. It's only possible when you still have quite a bit of detail there and you've been able to be relatively lucky with the exposure that you've captured. But let's have a quick look at what we're playing with here. So first thing I'll do is let's just raise the shadows completely so that you can see exactly what the foreground looks like. And I'll also completely drop the highlights down as well, so you can see exactly what the sky looks like without using any masking techniques yet. But in saying that, I don't want to affect the whole image by raising just the shadows and the highlights. I do want to work on the sky only and the foreground only, so that's why we're going to use Lightroom's masking technique. So we'll reset those quickly, and the very first thing we'll do is we'll go up here to Adobe Color and change that to landscape, because that always does bring out the colors a lot more. But the first thing we'll do is, well, let's just play around with a few of the global adjustments just to get a bit more contrast in the image. So we'll raise the contrast a little bit. That's about, no, that's too much. That's about fine there. We'll drop the highlights down just to bring out some detail in the sky before we mask it. A little bit more, there we go. And we'll raise the shadows a little bit as well, just so the mask has less work to do. And let's also just quickly bump up the vibrance, just to get some color in there before we add the mask, and a little bit of saturation as well. One thing to bear in mind is when you do get a raw photo, depending on the camera brand you're using naturally, there isn't a lot of color. So adding vibrance and saturation, I found, unless going for that muted look, I should say, often does improve the image, but that's my personal preference. You may have a completely different and don't want to touch vibrance and saturation, because it does depend on the sort of camera you're using. Every camera brand will have a different color profile and how it comes out on your computer as well. That's all we're going to do on a global scale. And by global, I mean that's how we're going to affect the shadows and the highlights of the whole image, not just particular parts of the image, but the image as a whole. So now let's jump back in and use their masking features, and we'll be able to play with the sky on its own and the foreground on its own and come up with that final image I showed you earlier. First thing we'll do is we'll go up here to mask, and we're going to go select sky. Thankfully, Lightroom has selected the sky quite well. It has got the buildings in there, but that's perfectly fine because I want to affect the buildings as well with this one. But before we do anything, I'm going to take this mask and I'm going to duplicate it, and then I'm going to invert it as well, so that this way, this one will be for the foreground. Now, to make sure I know exactly what I'm playing with, we're going to go foreground and rename this one, and then we'll take this one and we'll rename it as sky. Because if you remember how I like to edit in Photoshop, I like naming everything so I know exactly what I'm looking at. I'm doing exactly the same here so that I know which mask I'm playing with without needing to worry about the overlay features to see what I'm actually adjusting. This way I know I've got the sky selected or I've got the foreground selected, and it just makes managing everything a lot easier. So let's start with the sky first. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop down the highlights quite a bit. Well, not too much, but to about there. And I would like a bit more contrast in the sky as well, so we'll just bump the contrast in here a bit. That way now you can see it really brings out the differences between the colors and the separation between the clouds and the sky itself. I do like that halo around the sun. It does really add something nice to it. And just to make it a little bit darker, I'm going to drop the exposure just a tiny bit here, but not by much. Maybe that, like 1/10 of a stop, effectively, and that should be enough for the sky right there. And the only thing left to do is let's make the sky a little bit bluer. So we'll come down here to color, and let's just go through these options that we've got. No, that's too blue. That looks like an alien world. That's looking pretty good. That's not how the sky actually looked on the day, so we'll stick with this one, and that's it. So that's the sky done, and now we're going to play with the foreground, and there's quite a few more changes for the foreground than the sky, because the sky was literally just overblown and I wanted to bring the details back. But with the foreground there's a lot more detail to go over, so we'll play a little bit more with that one compared to the sky. Because this one is very dark, the first thing I'm going to do, so I don't have to play around with the shadows and the highlights too much, is raise the exposure a little bit, but not too much, just till about there. And the first one I'm going to raise is I'm going to raise the shadows a little bit. Actually quite a bit, not a little bit. I do want to bring in all the colors that are there, but not overdo it. That's fine. It is a bit bright in some areas, so we will drop the highlights a bit as well, but also not too much. But I do want to keep the detail in the grass and the leaves. So let's increase the texture a bit and the clarity as well. See how it brightens up when you increase the clarity, but let's not overdo it. That should be about fine right there. And I do want more color in the foreground compared to the sky as well. So let's bump up that saturation just a tiny bit. Just a little bit. No, this way. Not too much. That's... yeah, there we go. That's fine. And last but definitely not least, we're going to crop this. So let's change this to... let's see what 16:9 looks like. That looks pretty good. We'll straighten it out first. using those buildings in the center as a guide. Here's the final image. I hope you saw how when you've got a scene like this where you've got a huge dynamic range because we're effectively shooting straight into the sun, which made the foreground really dark and harder to retrieve compared to if you expose for the foreground, but that by finding a good balance in the middle, you are able to get a decent image out of it without needing to do something like HDR, high dynamic range processing, where you get Lightroom to blend 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, however many pictures you want of different exposures into one image, or taking two completely different exposures and then trying to manually blend them together in Photoshop. And if you look at this one with all the leaves on the trees in there and you wanted to blend that in Photoshop, that could take you a few hours. So that's just something to bear in mind. But I do want to repeat the caveat I mentioned earlier, is that if your sky is completely blown out, you may not be able to do this because the sensor would have processed it as just pure white. There wouldn't be any shadows or blacks to try and retrieve, even if you dropped the exposure all the way down, because the sensor just wouldn't have captured it. It would have just seen pure white and left it as is and nothing else. So just bear in mind, you do need some detail in the sky to try and get it back. If you do have cases where there is an even larger dynamic range than this, then you do need to think about doing something like exposure bracketing, where you shoot at different exposures, one for the sky and one for the foreground, and then either use Lightroom's HDR processing or manually blending them together in Photoshop. You'll have to play with it to see which one works best. If you're lucky, like in this particular case, you don't need to. You can just use Lightroom's masks and you'll be able to get a decent image out of it as well. If you do have any further questions about how I've edited this photo, please let me know in the comments below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Or if you have a similar image you need help editing with, let me know as well and I'll see what I can do to help you out. If you have liked this video, please do give it a thumbs up. That would be greatly appreciated. And if you want to make sure you don't miss out on any future videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and tick that little bell so you get a notification whenever a new video is released. I'll leave it there for now so I can try and get this thing fixed for the next time we head out. And I'll see you on the next one. That's it from me, and I'll see you next week. Have a good one.